All right, everyone. Now we're going to talk about the boot sequence. I know I mentioned it in the previous lesson. I did it kind of quickly. So I'm going to slow down the process a little bit because you really need to know the boot sequence. They will mess with you with these questions in the main, for the iOS portion of the router, the basic stuff. All right, so remember. All right, we said it in the last video, but I'm going to say it again. And then at the bottom, I got something special, all right, that they may throw at you. Okay? First thing that gets looked at when you turn on your router, the first thing that happens, come on, finger, do your job. All right, let's see if this thing will do its job. No? All right, no problem. We can circumvent that. Post. Post is going to do all the preoperative system checks, okay? To make sure everything's running smooth, everything's fine. All the hardware, what have you, just like in a computer. It's the same type of post. It's the very first thing that happens. Then the next thing is the bootstrap. The bootstrap, its job is to look for the iOS in the default location, which is what? Exactly, flash. So, for troubleshooting purposes, if you know that at that point in the boot up process, when the bootstrap is looking for the flash, and all of a sudden you find yourself in ramen, okay, that means that, hey, my iOS is missing or corrupted. All right, so that's a good hint for that. But let's say it found your flash. It found it found your iOS in flash. So once the bootstrap locates the iOS in flash, then the iOS looks at NVRAM. And really what it's doing, how is it looking at NVRAM? Because it's looking at the registry, and I'm going to be briefly through this. It's looking to see at the registry, because that's a question that you may get asked. What's the next step that it's going to do once it finds the iOS and it's going to load that image? Well, it's going to look towards the register settings. Is it 2102 or 2142? 2102, look at NVRAM and tell me if the configurations are there, and if they're there, load them. If it's 2142, ignore it. Okay? So that's what the iOS does. It looks at the registry, depending on what it's set to. It will either load the configurations or not load the configurations. And then once let's say it's at default and it looks at NVRAM and there's configs there. It loads the configs, you see the decompression, and boom, you're up in the in RAM, right? Everything gets loaded into RAM, and then you're prompted for your username and password, or just hit enter, and then you're asking for you're in user mode, you type enable, and then you may be asked for a password at that point. It all depends on the configurations that were configured in the startup config file. So that is the order, okay? The order: post, bootstrap, and it goes from the bootstrap to the iOS. From the iOS, it looks towards the registry to see if it looks at NVRAM, and that's important. It goes, the flash will look at the registry to see if it should look at the iOS or not look at the iOS. Okay? Depending if it's 2102 or 2142. And then if it is the default, which is 2102, it will look at NVRAM, load any configurations, if any, and then it goes on to load everything into RAM. So that's the default. Now here at the bottom, they may ask you, what if it doesn't find the iOS in flash? What's the next step that it will look for in iOS? It will look for a TFTP server. Now, if you're running ISR router, meaning integrated service routers, if they're connected to a LAN or a WAN environment already, and they can sense, they can detect that there's a connection, they will broadcast out looking for configurations. All right, now, if it's an ISR router, if it doesn't find it, you will quickly see that either you will load it and you will be in RAM, or you'll be in ramen, which would be a problem. With a non-ISR router, this is where you see the broadcast of 255, 255, 255, layer 3 broadcast, looking for a TFTP server. And that sounds like a question to me, boys and girls. All right, that when you see that it's looking for a TFTP server, it could be that, hey, it didn't find it in the default location. It could be that somebody used a boot system command that told it, hey, boot system, look for the flash in this particular TFTP server with this file name. So you could force it to boot, but if it doesn't find one in flash, it could back up to a TFTP server. And if it doesn't find one in a TFTP server, the last option is ROM. ROM. And if it goes into ROM to look for an iOS, what iOS is it going to find? It's going to find that mini iOS, all right, which is basically you're in ramen. That's what's really going to happen. You're going to be in ramen, and then you're like, oh, wow, you're going to be in, not trouble, but you're going to have some work ahead of you. All right, but again, to drill this down, remember, post comes first, does all its checking. Then it kicks the bootstrap. It kicks off. Bootstrap's looking for Flash. It's looking for iOS in Flash by default. If it finds it, Flash looks towards the registry to see if it looks or it doesn't look at NVRAM. And if it does look at NVRAM, if there's any configurations, then you're in RAM. But what if there's no configs? What if everything's default settings, right? Found the Flash, everything is 2102, that's the default. It looked at NVRAM and saw that NVRAM was empty. It said, hey, there's no configs. There's no configs in NVRAM. Fine. Then we are in setup mode. The initial configuration dialog, right? Setup mode. This is where we get the question, yes or no. So this process right here, you will be asked questions on this process. So this is something that you really need to understand. It's not going to be tricky questions. The trickiest question is this, or it could be this, some fashion of it. I don't know it verbatim or nothing like that. But if it's about to load, it found the iOS and it's about to load the image, what does it do next? Well, it's going to look at the registry because yes, it's going to look at NVRAM. It has to go to NVRAM, but in order to go to NVRAM, who tells it to go? The registry. The registry tells it to go. All right, so it all depends. So it will look at the registry, depending, 2102, look at it, 2142, ignore it, and then if it's ignoring it, it just boots you up into the router and doesn't load any configs. If it's 2102 and there's configs, it loads whatever configs were there. All right, if there's no configs and you're 2102, what happens? You're in setup mode. Let me show you real quick a router with no configs. All right, oh, not that right there. Minimize that. And open up the packet tracer. All right, let's put that, any router, doesn't matter which router. Just maximize it. You see, it's already, with a simulator it goes so quickly, but you saw the pound signs. You see that now we're in setup mode, the configuration dialog box, right? If you click yes, it's just going to, not if you click yes, if you type in yes, it's going to give you a bunch of questions because you can configure the router, the basic configurations of the router through this. Here I tell everybody you type no because we're going to be doing things from scratch. We're going to be doing things from scratch, okay? So there you go. That is your complete boot up process. Know it, love it, embrace it, remember it, all right, because you will be asked questions on it. So you need to understand that boot up order. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'll see you in the next lecture.